Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. Part 1, Fantine. Book 1, An Upright Man. Chapter 4, Works Matching Words. His conversation was friendly and light-hearted. He put himself on the level of the two old women who shared his life, and when he laughed it was the laughter of a schoolboy. Madame Magloire was pleased to address him as Your Greatness. On one occasion he rose from his armchair to get a book which was on a top shelf. He was short in stature and could not reach it. "Madame Magloire," he said, "will you be so good as to fetch a chair? My greatness does not extend so high." As distant connection, the Comtesse de Leu seldom missed an opportunity, when she was with him, of talking about what she called the hopes of her 3 sons. She had several very aged relatives, of whom her sons were the natural heirs. The youngest was due to inherit an income of 100,000 francs from a great-aunt. The second was the adopted heir of his uncle, a duke, and the oldest was direct heir to a peerage. As a rule, the bishop listened in silence to these blameless and forgivable maternal effusions, but on one occasion he appeared more abstracted than usual. "For heaven's sake, cousin," said the lady in mild exasperation, "what are you thinking about?" "I am thinking," said the bishop, "of the words uttered by, I believe, St. Augustine. 'Put your hope in him who has no successor.'" On another occasion, upon receiving a letter informing him of the death of one of the local gentry, which set forth in great detail the deceased's many titles of nobility and those of his family, he exclaimed, "Death has a broad back. What a great load of honors it can be made to bear, and how assiduous are the minds of men that they can use even the tomb in service of vanity." He had recourse at times to gentle raillery, in which there was nearly always a serious note. During one Lent, a youthful vicar came to preach in the cathedral at Dinan, and did so with some eloquence. His theme was charity. He urged the church to give to the poor so that they might escape the torments of hell, which he depicted in hideous terms, and attain to paradise, which he made to sound altogether delightful. Among the congregation was a Monsieur Geberand, a wealthy and grasping retired merchant, who had made a fortune in the cloth trade, but had never been known to give anything to the poor. It was observed, after the sermon, that on Sundays he handed a single sow to the old beggar-woman clustered outside the cathedral door. There were 6 of them to share it. Noting the event, the bishop smiled and said to his sister, "Monsieur Geberand is buying a pennyworth of paradise." He was not to be deterred in his labors for charity even by the direct refusal, and he found things to say which lingered in the mind. Among the company in a fashionable salon where he went to solicit alms was the Marquis de Champtercier, a rich elderly miser who contrived to both ultra-royalist and ultra-Voltairians. The type existed in those days. The bishop touched his arm and said, "Monsieur le Marquis, you must indeed give me something." The Marquis turned away, saying curtly, "Monseigneur, I have my own poor." "Give them to me," said the bishop. He preached the following sermon in the cathedral. "My brothers and friends, there are in France 1,320,000 peasant cottages which have only 3 outlets, 1,817,000 which have only 2, a door and window, and 346,000 which have only a door. This is due to something known as the tax on doors and windows. Consider the fate of poor families, old women and young children, living in these hovels, the fevers and other maladies. God gives air to mankind and the law sells it. I do not assail the law, but I give thanks to God. In Isère, in Var, and in the Upper and Lower Alps, the peasants do not even possess barrows, but carry the dung on their backs. They have no candles, but burn twigs and lengths of reap steeped in resin. That is what happens throughout the highlands of Dauphine. They make bread every 6 months, baking it over a fire of dried dung. In the winter they break the loaves with a hatchet and soak the bread for 24 hours before it can be eaten. My brothers, be merciful. Consider the sufferings of those around you." Having been born in Provence, he had had no difficulty in familiarizing himself with the dialects of the Midi, whether of Languedoc or the Lower Alps or Upper Dauphine. This pleased the people and had greatly helped to bring him close to them. He was at home, in the peasant's hut, and in the mountains. He could expound great matters in the simplest terms, and speaking all tongues could find his way to all hearts. For the rest, he was the same to all men, the fashionable world and the ordinary people. He judged nothing in haste, or without taking account of the circumstances. He said, "Let me see how the fault arose." Being, as he said with a smile, himself a former sinner, he lacked all sanctimoniousness, and without self-righteous flourishes preached in forthright terms of doctrine, which may be summed up as follows. The flesh is at once man's burden and his temptation. He bears it and yields to it. He must keep watch over it and restrain it, and obey it only in the last resort. Such obedience may be a fault, but it is a venial fault. It is a fall, but a fall onto the knees which may end in prayer. To be a saint is to be an exception. To be a true man is the rule. Err, fail, sin, if you must, but be upright. To sin as little as possible is the law for men. To sin not at all is a dream for angels. All earthly things are subject to sin. It is like the force of gravity. Any ill-considered outburst of popular indignation would cause him to smile. "It appears," he would say, "that this is a crime which everyone commits. See how outraged hypocrisy hurries to cover itself." He was indulgent to women and to the poor, oppressed by the weight of society. "The faults of women, children, and servants," he said, "and of the weak, the poor, and the ignorant, are the faults of husbands, fathers, and masters, and of the strong, the rich, and the learned." He also said, "Teach the ignorant as much as you can. Society is to blame for not giving free education. It is responsible for the darkness it creates. The soul in darkness sins, but the real sinner is he who caused the darkness." As we can see, he had his own way of looking at things. I think he derived it from the gospel. He listened one day to a drawing-room discussion of a crime which was then under interrogation and was shortly to be tried. For love of a woman, and the child she had borne him, a wretched man, at the end of his resources, had coined false currency. Counterfeiting at the time was punishable by death. The woman had been arrested when attempting to pass the first coin the man had forged. She was detained, but there was no evidence except against her, and she alone could destroy her lover by testifying against him. She denied everything and persisted in her denial. The public prosecutor then advised a plan. By the cunning use of fragments of letters, he persuaded the unhappy woman that her lover had been unfaithful to her, and in a fit of jealousy she divulged everything. The man was doomed. Both would be tried, and he would be convicted. The tale was told, and everyone was in raptures over the artfulness of the prosecutor, who had brought the truth to light and caused justice to be done by appealing to jealousy and the instinct of revenge. The bishop listened to it all in silence and finally asked, "Where are this man and woman to be tried?" "At the assizes atAux." "And where will the prosecutor be tried?" A tragic event occurred in Dinan. A man was sentenced to death for murder. He was a man, neither wholly educated nor illiterate, who had been a fair-ground performer and a public letter-writer. His trial had aroused great interest in the town. On the even of the day fixed for his execution, the prison almoner fell ill. A priest was needed to solace the condemned man's last moments. The curé was sent for, but it seems that he refused to come, saying that it was no concern of his, that he had nothing to do with the mountebank in question, that he was himself unwell, and that in any case it was not his place. When this was reported to the bishop, he said, "The curé is right. It is not his place, but mine." He went at once to the prison and to the mountebank's cell, where he addressed him by name, took his hand, and talked to him. He spent the rest of the day and the night with him, without food or sleep, praying to God for his soul and exhorting the man to have regard for it himself. He repeated the greatest truths, which are the simplest. He was the man's father, brother, friend. His bishop only to bless him. The man had been about to die in utter despair. Death to him was an abyss, and trembling upon that awful threshold he recoiled in fear. He was not so ignorant as to be wholly unmoved. The profound shock of his condemnation had in some sort pierced the veil which separates us from mystery of things, and which we call life. Peering beyond this world through those fateful rents, he saw nothing but darkness. The bishop caused him to see light. When they came for the man next day, the bishop went with him, showing himself to the crowd at the side of a fettered wretch, in his purple hood, and with the episcopal cross hanging from his neck. He went with him in the tumbril and on to the scaffold. The man, who had been so desolate the day before, was now radiant. His soul was at peace, and he hoped for God. The bishop kissed him and said, when the knife was about to fall, "Whom man kills, God restores to life. Whom the brothers pursue, the Father redeems. Pray and believe and go onward into life. Your Father is there." When he came down from the scaffold, there was something in his gaze which caused the people to draw back. No one could have said which was the more striking, his pallor or his serenity. Returning to the humble abode which he smilingly called his palace, he said to his sister, "I have been performing one of the duties of my office." Since the most sublime acts are often the least understood, there were people in town who said it was all affectation, but this was drawing-room comment. The common people, who do not look for shabbiness where none exists, were deeply moved. As for the bishop himself, the spectacle of the guillotine caused him a shock from which he was slow to recover. A scaffold, when it is erected and prepared, has indeed a profoundly disturbing effect. We may remain more or less open-minded on the subject of the death penalty, indisposed to commit ourselves so long as we have not seen a guillotine with our own eyes, but to do so is to be so shaken that we are obliged to take our stand for or against. Joseph de Maistre approved of the death penalty. César de Beccaria abominated it. The guillotine is the ultimate expression of law, and its name is vengeance. It is not neutral, nor does it allow us to remain neutral. He who sees it shudders in the most confounding dismay. All social questions achieve their finality around that blade. The scaffold is an image. It is not merely a framework, a machine, a lifeless mechanism of iron, wood, and rope. It is as though it were a being having its own dark purpose, as though the framework saw, the machine listened, the mechanism understood, as though that arrangement of wood and iron and rope expressed a will. In the hideous picture which its presence evokes, it seems to be most terribly a part of what it does. It is the executioner's accomplice. It consumes, devouring flesh and drinking blood. It is a kind of monster created by the judge and the craftsman, a spectre seeming to live an awful life born of the death it deals. This was the effect it had upon the bishop, and on the day following the execution, and for many days after, he seemed to be overwhelmed. The almost violent serenity of the faithful moment vanished. He was haunted by the ghost of social justice. Whereas ordinarily he returned from the performance of his duties with a glow of satisfaction, he seemed now to be assailed with a sense of guilt. There were times when he talked to himself, muttering gloomy monologues under his breath. This is a fragment that his sister overheard. "I do not know that it was so monstrous. It is wrong to become so absorbed in divine law that one is no longer aware of human law. Death belongs only to God. What right have men to lay hands on a thing so unknown?" Gradually, those impressions faded, and perhaps died away altogether, but it was observed that the bishop thenceforth avoided passing the place of executions. Monsignor Muriel could be summoned at any hour to the bedside of the sick and the dying. He did not forget that this was his first and greatest duty. Widowed and orphaned families had no need to send for him. He came of his own accord. He would sit for hours in silence with the man who had lost the wife he loved or the mother who had lost her child. But if he knew when to keep silent, he also knew when to speak. The wisest of comforters, he did not seek to banish sorrow in forgetfulness, but to ennoble and dignify it with hope. "Take care how you view the dead," he said. "Do not think of that which rots. Look steadily, and you will see the living light of your beloved in the bosom of heaven." He knew that faith gives health. He sought to counsel and soothe the despairing by pointing to the resigned, and to transform the grief which sees only a pit into the grief which sees a star. Chapter 5. How Monsignor Bienvenu made his cassocks last too long. Monsignor Muriel's private life was shaped by the same thoughts as his life in public. To anyone privileged to witness it at first hand, the self-imposed austerity of the Bishop of Denay was at once impressive and charming. Like all old men and most thinkers, he slept little, but his brief slumbers were profound. In the morning he spent an hour in meditation and then said Mass, either in the cathedral or in his oratory. Having done so, he breakfasted on rye bread soaked in milk of his own cows. Then he started work. A bishop is a busy man. He has to see the clerk of the diocese every day, and on most days one or more of his vicars. He has to preside over meetings, grant dispensations, cast an eye over the flow of church publications, and attend to countless parochial affairs. He has to write pastoral letters, approve sermons, and resolve differences between cures and mayors, besides conducting a correspondence which is both clerical and administrative, with the state on one hand and the Holy See on the other. In short, he has 1,000 matters to attend to. Such free time as these occupations, as well as the daily offices and his breviary, allowed him, Monsignor Muriel devoted to the needy and afflicted, and in the remaining time he worked. That is to say, he dug his garden, or read, and wrote. And for him both kinds of work bore the same name. Both he called gardening. The spirit is a garden, he said. He dined at midday, a meal little different from his breakfast. At about 2 o'clock, if the weather was fine, he would set out on foot through the countryside or the streets of the town, often visiting the humblest homes. He was to be seen walking alone with his head bowed in thought, leaning on his long stick, wrapped in a very warm quilted purple cloak, with purple stockings and heavy shoes, and wearing on his head the flat tricorn hat with gilt tassels hanging from its points. There was a stir wherever he went, as though with his very passing he brought warmth and light. Children and old men came to the doorstep to greet him as they might greet the sunshine. Those in need were shown the way to his dwelling. He blessed and was blessed. Now and then he stopped to talk to the children and smile at their mothers. He visited the poor when he had money. When he had none, he visited the rich. Since he wore his cassocks until they were threadbare and did not wish the fact to be noticed, he never went into town except in that padded cloak, which in summer was rather uncomfortable. At 8:30 in the evening he had supper with his sister, while Madame Magloire stood over them waiting at table. No meal could be more frugal. But if one of his cures had been invited to supper, Madame Magloire took advantage of the circumstance to prepare something more lavish, fish from the lakes or game from the hills. Any cure served as a pretext for a solid meal, and the bishop acquiesced in this. Otherwise the meal consisted of boiled vegetables and fried bread. They said in the town, "When the bishop is not eating like a cure, he eats like a Trappist monk." After supper he talked for half an hour with his sister and Madame Magloire, and then withdrew to his own room to resume his writing, either on loose sheets of paper or in the margins of some folio volume. He was a man of letters and something of a scholar, and he has left behind him 6 manuscripts which are not without interest, including an essay on a line of Genesis, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. He contrasts this with 3 other versions: the Arabic, the winds of God blew; that of Flavius Josephus, a wind from on high descended upon earth; and finally the Chaldean version of the Rabbi Onkelos, a wind from God blew upon the face of the waters. In another essay he examines the theological writings of Charles Louis Hugo, Bishop of Ptolemais, a great-great-uncle of the present writer, in which he proves that a number of pamphlets published in the last century under the pseudonym Our Barleycorn are to be attributed to this prelate. Sometimes while reading he would sink into a profound reverie, from which he would emerge to scribble a few lines on the pages of whatever book he had in his hand. These jottings often had nothing to do with the book itself. We have before us a note written in the margin of a volume entitled Correspondence du Lord Germain, avec les généraux Clinton, connois et les amoureux de la station de l'Amérique à Versailles, chez Poincourt Labré et à Paris, chez Pissot Librairie, quae des Augustins. The note is as follows. O thou which art, Ecclesiastes names thee Almighty, the Maccabees name thee Creator, the Epistle to the Ephesians names thee Liberty, Baruch names thee Immensity, the Psalms name thee Wisdom and Truth, John names thee Light, the Book of Kings names thee Lord, Exodus names thee Providence, Leviticus Sanctity, Esdras Justice, Creation names thee God, man names thee Father, but Solomon names thee Compassion, which is the most beautiful of all thy names. At about 9 o'clock the 2 women went upstairs to their rooms, leaving him alone on the ground floor until morning. And here it is necessary that we should give an exact account of the dwelling of Monsignor, the Bishop of Denay.